During the Second World War, espionage and intelligence became increasingly important strategic assets. Espionage played a key role in shortening the war with hundreds of intelligence, commando, and disinformation missions. These included capturing and cracking of the German Enigma encryptor, smuggling weapons through Greece by naval commanders, and musicians smuggling information with sheet music. As the war went on, restructuring and expansion of intelligence services became extremely important. Not only were they meant to help the Allies win the war, but they were also meant to function in the new post-war world. This paved the way for the modern British SIS, created the American CIA, and eventually the Soviet KGB. In 1941, USA and United Kingdom started secretly sharing intelligence. 2 years later, the relationship was deepened with the BR-USA agreement, laying the foundation for one of the largest intelligence alliances in history. These were the secret realities of the war, and very soon they became popular fiction. James Bond is a key institution of modern fiction, with a history of over 30 novels and a series of 25 films, which formed the fourth most successful film series in history. With the film series turning 60 in 2022, the fans are once again commemorating the pretty women, cool cars, exotic locations, creative gadgets, and grand action scenes. However, if we go deeper, the series is also notable for taking inspiration for its stories from real geopolitical events. Using the real world to inspire fiction is of course a key staple of all relevant entertainment, but Bond series is unique because its longevity has given it a historical perspective that few properties have. This perspective also raised the question, if the series has taken elements from reality, how does it in exchange respond to it? What kind of meaning does the series find from our increasingly complicated world that is at the same time more transparent and more opaque? Or is it all just an alcohol-poisoned sooty-booty charade? If you want to entertain this little idea, the proper place to start is the very beginning.
Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Ian Fleming was born in 1908 in the United Kingdom into a life of privilege. Family included a father Valentine, mother Evelyn, and a brother Peter. Ian's father died in World War I, and after this, the overbearing mother built him as an example of virtue for the sons. Peter became a successful travel writer, while Ian's early adulthood was filled with hedonism and indecision.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Fleming. It's Janet from the office.
I'm glad you called, actually. I've got a terrible migraine.
He joined the Royal Military College, but left after a year because of his indifference to military life, among other reasons.
You resigned.
For God's sake. You made me.
Do I have to remind you why you had gonorrhea?
I suppose that was her fault as well.
He then tried to get to the diplomatic field through the British Foreign Office. He passed the entrance exam acceptably, but wasn't hired. However, he had learned several languages, like French, German, and some Russian, and he was well traveled. So, through his mother's connections, Ian got a job at Reuters news agency as a sub-editor and a journalist. His job most notably took him to Soviet Union, where he sought an interview with Stalin, whom politely refused. Due to bad pay, he resigned and became a not-so-good stockbroker, filling his free time with traveling, luxuries, women and art, and the art was mostly just porn.
God, it's a first edition.
He also consumed a lot of literature, like John Buchan's 39 Steps and H.C. McNeill's novels on Bulldog Drummond, a great war veteran and a gentleman adventurer. Fleming was fascinated by the heroes of these novels, who were charming solitary men of action. Like with so many others, Ian's life took a turn with World War II. Once again, through his family connections, he was placed under Rear Admiral John Godfrey, and at the start of the war, Fleming was promoted to a rank of lieutenant commander. Based on this, it is easy to assume that Fleming was just a privileged layabout scuttling along through the war. However, due to his education and work history, Fleming had a very applicable imagination, and therefore he essentially became a fixer and a strategic ideas man for the naval intelligence. For example, Fleming's idea on how to get the setting information to crack the Nazi encryptor machine Enigma. His plan was to capture a German bomber, staff it with a group of 5 men, and then crash it to the sea while sending an SOS signal to the German ships. Once a ship would come to the rescue, the men would take over the ship and retrieve the Enigma-setting information. The mission was called off, possibly because the British were informed that the German bomber planes couldn't actually float. His famous success, however, was an idea of a disinformation mission, where a body of a supposed dead officer was dropped to the sea carrying false intel about Allied plans. In 1943, during Operation Mincemeat, a body was dropped to the coast of Spain. Intel that the body had claimed that the Allies were planning a land invasion of Greece and Sardinia. This fooled the Nazis, paving the way for a successful land invasion of Sicily. Also, very evocatively, Fleming was a key creator of 30 Assault Units, a collection of intelligence commandos that made several high-risk missions behind enemy lines. Fleming himself really wanted to partake in the war as a leader of this unit, but it was deemed that he was more valuable in the administration, and it would have been an intelligence disaster if he was caught by the enemy. Nevertheless, he continued applying his intellectual talents. For example, he worked as a liaison for the Americans and wrote a memorandum on how intelligence services should be structured, which possibly helped in the formation of the future CIA. His colleagues have also claimed that during this time, Fleming started entertaining the idea of a spy novel.
In the Baltic, to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
After the war, Britain was in economic disarray. Rationing was still in effect, and empire was coming undone with colonies like India seeking independence. On geopolitical field, the dust had barely settled when the threat of even more destructive war came to a head. With ever-increasing threat of the former Allied Soviet Union and the start of the Cold War, UK was filled with a sense of obsolescence. Fleming went back to journalism as a foreign manager for the Kemsley newspaper group, owned by Sunday Times. His maverick bachelor life, however, came to an end when his longtime lover Anne became pregnant. She got a divorce from his husband, press magnate Esmond Hamsworth, the second Viscount of Rothermere, and Fleming, feeling responsible, decided to marry her. Anxiety of a marriage was the thing that finally made him sit down and write his quote-unquote spy story to end all spy stories. So, in conclusion, we have an old-fashioned British gentleman who is in a state of crisis with letting go of a bachelor's life, living through the decline of the British Empire, and witnessing the world-ending threat of the nuclear war. He has an extensive history with intelligence and espionage. His favorite authors wrote about adventure heroes who were very brave and very resourceful, and okay, let's not drag this out anymore. During his honeymoon, Fleming finished Casino Royale. The novel was inspired by his supposed real experience in Lisbon, where he tried to get his hands on a Nazi officer's money through a baccarat card game, which ended in failure. The novel was released in 1953. The first chapter, properly titled The Secret Agent, introduces us to MI6 operative James Bond. A strong drink-loving gambler on a secret mission to observe Le Chiffre, a Soviet financial handler who has recently lost millions of Soviet state funds by investing in French brothels just before laws on prostitution are tightened. Bond is tasked with a mission to beat Le Chiffre in a baccarat card game to keep him from getting back the lost money. During the story, Bond meets Vesper Lynd, a soft-spoken aide who Bond, after initial annoyance, falls in love with. The mission is a success, and Le Chiffre gets eliminated by the Russian counter-espionage organization SMERSH. However, Bond's heart gets broken when Vesper in a suicide note confesses actually being a Russian asset. Cursing how the enemy got so close to him, he vows to go on a journey and to find the hand that holds the whip. Especially during the 50s, Fleming's novels painted James Bond as a Western patriot whose adversaries were connected to the Soviet Union and the counter-espionage organization SMERSH, who have infiltrated several facets of the Western world. In reality, SMERSH was an umbrella organization for 3 different counterintelligence services. The name, which was a portmanteau for Smer Spionem, meaning death to spies, was actually coined by Stalin. It was formed in 1943 to combat the Nazi threat, but then expanded to seek out and neutralize any threat facing the USSR. Among other things, they interrogated foreign spies, captured defectors, and destroyed counter-revolutionary groups. They also ended up recruiting up to 3.4 million Soviet soldiers as informants to make sure that the Russian military remained in line. Smersh built a reputation of efficiency, and it's been claimed that they neutralized almost 40,000 German agents during the war, for example through their infamous radio games. How many of the neutralized were actually agents is unclear. Smersh partook in arrests of over 600,000 people, many of whom were executed or sent to gulags. Many prisoners didn't have anything to do with espionage, being just deserters, self-injured, or deemed politically unreliable. Smersh was officially disbanded in 1946. Fleming as a naval commander was very familiar with Smersh and brutality of their methods, making them an obvious villain in his Cold War stories. In Live and Let Die, Bond confronts Mr. Big, a voodoo fanatic Harlem-based gangster who is trying to locate an old pirate treasure. Big is also a Smersh agent, whose motivation is to use the treasure to finance Soviet interests. One of his key tools is manipulation of the African American communities with superstition. Yikes. In Goldfinger, the eponymous character is a businessman who finances Soviet interests with his gold resources and tries to stage robbery of the US gold reserves in Fort Knox. In Moonraker, we get a triple threat in Hugo Drax, an entrepreneurial gentleman who is also an ex-Nazi working for the Soviet Union, with the objective of nuking London. The novels take their themes heavily from Cold War paranoia, especially regarding the Red Scare and the secret Soviet invasion. In 1951, British intelligence community was shook to its core when two diplomats, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess, made headlines by suddenly disappearing. This led to fervent public speculation that they were secret Soviet spies who had now defected. Gradually, the public was made aware of the Cambridge Five, a Soviet spy ring working inside Britain, a group of men whom, based on their prestigious backgrounds, were deemed so patriotic that their betrayal didn't seem believable. These defections hindered USA's and its allies' trust in the UK and stained the public perception of the British Secret Service. Fleming, who knew some of these men, was shocked by these betrayals. During the 1950s, USA held the notorious communist hearings that were headed by the Senator Joseph McCarthy. In those hearings, McCarthy spearheaded the conspiracy theory of a network of communists living in the United States in different levels of society. These included Hollywood, political groups, and labor unions. Ironically, Fleming denounced McCarthy, ridiculing the quote-unquote prairie fire of fear, intolerance, and hatred he had instigated. By the end of the 1950s, Bond novels had found international success. Even though the stories were outlandish, they had so much public legitimacy that Egyptian intelligence services started using them in spycraft education. Which is notable since in 1956, Britain came into conflict with Egypt in the Suez Crisis. Egypt's president, Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, which had been owned by the Suez Canal Company that was primarily led by France and Britain. Knowing that this would weaken their imperial influence on the region, France and Britain allied with Israel and seized the Suez Canal. This was met with massive international condemnation, most notably by the USA, whom wasn't consulted on the matter. After considerable international and economic pressure, the occupiers retreated from the area. The humiliation that Britain faced forced them to recognize that they didn't have the imperial power anymore that allowed them to conduct their own foreign policy without the support from their stronger allies. Secret services reside in secrecy, but paradoxically, they are also very conscious of their public image. This became explicit in 1956, when defected diplomats, Maclean and Burgess, resurfaced in Russia and became public figures. This was embarrassing for Britain, but they couldn't legally do anything about it. This conundrum was explored in From Russia with Love, with explicit references to Maclean and Burgess. The plot involves the Soviets hatching a plan that would let them kill Bond and publicly embarrass the mythical British Secret Service, which they almost succeed in. In the late 50s, after Stalin had died and Nikita Khrushchev came into power, a process of de-Stalinization started in the USSR. With the increased understanding of the nuclear threat, growing scientific cooperation between East and the West, and the avoidance of direct skirmishes, the Cold War showed signs of thawing. The Cavalier fanaticism gave way, and Fleming pointed his attention to threats that weren't ideological, but instead coldly economical. The 1961 novel Thunderball introduces the readers to the secret criminal organization Spectre. This dastardly group steals 2 nuclear warheads that they threaten to use if they don't get paid a ransom of £100 million. Under Spectre's umbrella is a collection of organizations like Sicilian Mafia, Turkish Heroin Ring, former members of Gestapo, and even Smersh. With its demands for unquestionable loyalty and absolute secrecy, Spectre echoes real organized crime groups, which is then expanded to a scale of international terrorism. Spectre's structure has similarities to Italian-American mafia that during the 20th century was based around the 5 big families, which for a while were led by a single boss of all bosses. Spectre's leader, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, has this position, and he shares some qualities with legendary criminals like Al Capone, with his successes, but also with his decaying sanity, implicitly caused by a syphilis infection. As a replacer of Smersh, Spectre is unique due to its pursuit of purely economic benefits. They are not bound by ideology or principles, and therefore they can be even more ruthless and calculating. One curious detail that is unique to the novel version of Spectre is that they are not really a secret organization. In the beginning of Thunderball, we find out that both Eastern and Western powers have welcomed aid from this unknown but powerful third party in order to push their own self-interests. Through this, Spectre has been able to grow and now exacts massive leverage on its former clients. In this way, Spectre is almost an allegory for the moral compromises nations make to protect their interests. The introduction of Spectre shifts Bond's priorities from an agent containing communism into a more of an international crime fighter. Through the novels, Fleming ruminates on a changing world where Britain simply isn't the great power it once was. Bond, as a capable man of action, alleviates these anxieties by portraying a secret fictional world where Britain can still affect change in a global scale. In a sense, he is a man of heroic past. For the character to survive, however, a way forward had to be found.
1,000.
I admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
In 1962, Albert Broccoli's and Harry Saltzman's Eon production in collaboration with United Artists releases Dr. No. Like Fleming, majority of the department heads in the film were actually war veterans, including the director Terence Young, who was an actual tank commander. The film sees Bond going to Caribbean islands and face against the Chinese-German nuclear scientist Dr. Julius No, who is trying to disrupt the American Mercury space launch. In the novel, Dr. No's plan only concerns US missiles. This was updated to a NASA operation because in 1961, Soviet Union performed the first successful manned spaceflight with Yuri Gagarin, causing concerns in the US that they were falling behind in the space race. The first film already includes a key scene that sets the divergence from the novels.
Missiles are only the first step to prove our power.
Our power? With your disregard for human life, you must be working for the East.
East, west, just points of the compass, each as stupid as the other. I'm a member of Spectre.
Spectre?
Spectre.
This is a deviation from the novel, where No is a Smersh agent. This was a conscious decision by the producers to tone down the jingoistic political mentality of the novels. Dr. No became a massive success, and its setting and world had an unexpected legitimacy when just 2 weeks after the premiere, something even bigger happened at the Caribbeans. Yeah, that Cold War that was supposed to thaw, well, it didn't. Provoked by the Bay of Pigs invasion, Soviet Union started moving nuclear armaments to Cuba. United States responded with a naval blockade and an ultimatum that any ship that would try to breach the blockade would be sunk. Situation tensed so much that a Soviet submarine almost launched a nuclear attack, which was only stopped by a single disobedient officer. Both sides were partially ignorant of the other's actions, but because the stakes were so high, choice had to be made between trust and fear. Khrushchev knew the situation might escalate quickly beyond their control, especially because unbeknownst to USA, Cuba already had 162 Soviet nukes that the Cuban leader Fidel Castro might actually be crazy enough to use. Fortunately, a deal was struck where USSR would dismantle its armaments in Cuba if USA publicly promises not to try invading Cuba again. In secret, USA also promised to dismantle its nuclear armaments in Turkey, and thus, the Third World War was averted. With Cold War so heavily in the collective mind, it makes sense people responded to Bond films. But the Cold War of the 60s wasn't quite the same as the 50s. The awareness that we might face annihilation just because of a mistake had become too real. Bond films set the early thematic precedents with Dr. No that states that the threat to the world isn't necessarily the USSR. The true threat are third parties who can exploit the fear and distrust of the superpowers for their own gain. In the second film, From Russia with Love, Naval's very heavy-handed Russian plan to undermine MI6's greatness was modified into a grand plan where Spectre plays both sides against each other. In Goldfinger, the title villain, who in the novel is a SMERSH agent, is a private entrepreneur who with the Chinese help tries to irradiate the Fort Knox, making his gold more valuable. The anxiety based on mistrust reaches its apex in You Only Live Twice, where Spectre, in cahoots with an unnamed Asian government, captures both US and USSR spaceships to provoke a third world war. But wait, twice in a row now, Asians have been pointed out as the secondary villains. Did the films just change from one communist villain state to another? Well, yes, but consider the time period. While Khrushchev and after him Leonid Brezhnev pursued stable coexistence, China was still led by Mao Zedong, who still pushed for global communist revolution. This distancing was emphasized because Soviets saw Mao being cavalier with the idea of a nuclear war. This doctrinal divergence led to a gradual Sino-Soviet split that deteriorated their mutual cooperation. Nevertheless, even in these cases, the Asians are a small background player that partner with ironically very capitalistic groups. Compared to the novels, the films are more cautious about rivalry of the East and the West, because the cost of something going wrong could have been so devastating. Bond and Britain are placed as the calm third party in between the hot-headed USA and USSR, fighting enemies who callously exploit this tension and the destruction it risks.
Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid policeman whose luck is run out.
By the end of the 60s, the series started waning from direct Cold War stories. World states wasn't calm with the escalation of the Vietnam War and the Arab-Israeli 6 Days War. However, after some showboating by China and France with their nuclear tests, vast majority of the relevant nations signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in the early 1972, USA and USSR signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM. United States and Soviet Union were engaging in détente, an easing of tension between superpowers that showed real promise. So in general, the key international anxieties went to the back burner and the themes of the series became more localized. 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service saw an Australian candy model, George Lazenby, in his only appearance trying to stop the head of Spectre, Blofeld. This time his plan is to blackmail the world with a sterilizing virus.
They believe your threat.
Oh, they will. In any case, I have prepared a demonstration. Remember that disagreeable outbreak of foot-and-mouth disease in England last summer?
The film makes a direct reference to 1967's foot-and-mouth disease outbreak that affected Britain and mainland Europe. The outbreak led to a slaughter of 430,000 cows and was the last known case of human contamination. 1971's Diamonds Are Forever veers into some ludicrous levels of fantasy while building itself on contemporary news curiosities. These included the notorious recluse Howard Hughes' stand-in Willard White and the widespread criminal activity of Las Vegas, which of course lead to space lasers. 1973's Live and Let Die takes Bond to an alien territory by having him investigate heroin trafficking in New York and Louisiana. The villain, Dr. Kananga, seeks to give up 2,000 kilos of heroin to the streets in order to create a mass dependency and a future drug marketplace. This echoed the rapidly rising drug problem in New York, with approximately 200,000 addicts by the early 70s. In 1978, New York City Special Prosecutor had declared Harlem the drug trafficking center of the nation. I must point out, though, that heroin generally came from Southwestern Asia, not Louisiana or the Caribbeans. But the film is pretty problematic anyway. One of the exasperators of drug-related problems is a bad economy, and during the early 70s, the world fell into a recession due to the oil shock. The oil shock was a result of a Yom Kippur war fought between Israel and a coalition of Egypt and Syria. Because USA intervened on Israeli side, the Arab delegation of OPEC initiated an oil embargo. This created massive petroleum shortages, causing stagnating growth in the West. This bolstered international conversations about alternative energy sources, including solar power.
It's best so you've told me. Coal and oil will soon be depleted. Uranium's too dangerous. Geothermal and tidal control too expensive. I know all that.
This inspired Solex Solar Agitator, a device in The Man with the Golden Gun, a device that several public and private powers are interested in, including the villain Francisco Scaramanga, played by the daddiest of daddy, Christopher Lee.
I could have shot you down when you landed, but that would have been ridiculously easy.
Based on the solar-powered island of Scaramanga, the film seems to be optimistic about sun as an energy source of the future. While the challenges of energy and economy remained, Bond was called back to world-ending threats, but the field of friends and adversaries had changed. The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker are essentially thematic companions where a single megalomaniac tries to destroy the world and start a new civilization, whom is then defeated with international cooperation. Stromberg wants to nuke the world and start a civilization under the sea, and Drax tries to poison the world and start a master race. Apparently the sun harnessing technology didn't solve everything. These films, especially The Spy Who Loved Me, are very détente-influenced movies. 10 years earlier, the films were concerned with volatile mistrust and seemed to champion somewhat stable but isolated coexistence. In Spy Who Loved Me, MI6's M and KGB's General Gogol come together with their agents to stop something that threatens both their existence. This hopeful mentality is upheld in Moonraker, where the British and Americans share their battle plans with Gogol and the Soviet Union. One curious thing about the villains in these two films is that compared to previous ones' economic priorities, their plans are fanatical and seek to reject the current state of the world. When seen this way, the films seem to emphasize the virtue of institutions and society against those that seek to reject them. In any case, this kind of collaboration between East and the West was sadly short-lived. "1979 saw the Cold War tensions resuming with a vengeance when the USSR invaded Afghanistan. In response, USA boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, essentially ending the policies of détente. Carter administration gave way to new conservatism of Ronald Reagan, who called USSR an evil empire, fueling the sentiment the only way to end the Cold War is to win it. UK's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher supported the notion, declaring that USSR was quote-unquote bent on world domination. 80s also saw the UK engaging in the Falklands War against Argentina. With For Your Eyes Only, Bond came back to Earth and faced a very prescient threat based around the conflicting interests of the East and the West. Bond is tasked with finding a cutting-edge piece of technology called Automatic Targeting Attack Communicator, or ATAC, before it ends up in the Russian hands. The ATAC device echoes the Lecter from the film From Russia with Love, but by the 80s, Western military superiority was becoming more and more apparent. The Cold War background is amplified by setting the film in Greece and having the villain and the ally be veterans of the Second World War and the Greek Civil War. In the film, we find out that Christatos, who got a medal by the British for his actions, was actually a double agent working for the Soviets, while Colombo was the actual brave anti-communist hero. A bit of history. Since the World War, Greece was fraught with deep-seated divide between left and right. After two other conflicts, the tensions culminated into a civil war fought between 1946 and 1949. The anti-communist forces won, partially because of the breakdown of communist support caused by the tensions between Stalin and Yugoslavian leader Josip Broz Tito. Tito wanted to support Greek communist forces until the end, while Stalin had already promised Churchill not to do so himself. Greece came under the Western influence, but it was left with a ruined economy and even more toxic political divide. This eventually led to a 1967 coup by the anti-communist military junta. Junta's dictatorship is marked by years of brutality, censorship, and political imprisonments. Despite these crimes, USA legitimized the junta's reign with a presidential state visit. Fortunately, the junta was dissolved in 1974, and Greece turned into the modern Hellenic Republic. By omitting this key point of Greek history, the film makes a claim for Western moral superiority with rather questionable means. The film ends with former ally General Gogol coming in to retrieve ATAC from the villains, but Bond gets there first. In a surprising act, Bond destroys the device, so neither could have it, thus reaffirming the policies of détente.
That's détente, comrade. You don't have it, I don't have it.
Even though the tensions were rising again, the films tried to hold on to the optimism and champion the possibilities of peace. Octopussy continues with this testy optimism. The film revolves around rogue Soviet General Orlov's plan to arrange a nuclear explosion in an American military base in East Germany. This would force NATO to retreat from the East Europe, paving the way for the Soviet invasion. In comparison to For Your Eyes Only, which had more of a disarmament mentality, Octopussy reaffirms the idea that there is a need for a strong defense. The film, however, does make its optimism clear, with a single malicious individual in the heart of the Soviet power structures. This essentially redeems the Soviet system, shouldering the threat of escalation to few dissidents inside it. This view was continued in A View to a Kill, with the villain Max Zorin being a self-interested KGB agent who tries to destroy Silicon Valley, which the Soviets specifically do not want. The film ends with Bond becoming the first non-Soviet citizen to be awarded a medal by the Order of Lenin. This optimistic, albeit naive and quite one-sided sentiment was echoed by the producer Michael G. Wilson.
The company never took Bond for granted. He never took the audiences for granted. There was a feeling that one day we would see Bond films in China, in Russia, that there were people of goodwill on both sides that didn't want the world to descend into chaotic violence. That was part of our wishful thinking.
While the tensions rose with USSR boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the winds of change started to blow when Mikhail Gorbachev came into power in 1985. His rhetoric of peace, while welcomed, wasn't necessarily immediately convincing. Soviet-Afghan war was still raging on, and the news were taken by senior KGB officer Vitaly Yurchenko's defection to the West, whom shortly after went back to USSR, creating strong suspicion that the whole thing was a Soviet ploy, which hasn't been confirmed. The Living Daylights is an adaptation and expansion of a Fleming short story about a Russian general that seeks to defect to the West. The film then blooms into a semi-pretty convoluted plot where the said Russian general Koskov and American war nut Brad Whitaker want to profit from the ongoing escalation of the Soviet-Afghan war. Compared to previous films from the decade, The Living Daylights is decidedly more serious by mixing the themes of the 50s with headlines of the 80s. This is emphasized by the enthusiasm of the MI6 for having a successful retrieval of a Soviet defector, the villains creating a diversion by reintroducing an old enemy, and M demanding Bond to kill a respected Soviet general. The film culminates with Bond waging battle against the Soviet forces on the side of the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, or the Holy Warriors, were Afghan nationals who were armed and trained by the Americans, with the coalition that also included, for example, UK, West Germany, and surprisingly, Israel and China. Soviet Union was driven out of Afghanistan by 1989. Unfortunately, the country was in ruins, and due to weak support on societal rebuilding by the West, Afghanistan fell vulnerable to outside exploitation and quickly fell into a civil war. Many of the Mujahideen formed jihadist groups, and by 1996, Taliban had taken over Afghanistan. One of the men who was an ally to Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan war was Osama bin Laden. By the late 1980s, a period of rapid thawing started. Reagan and Gorbachev met, and treaty banning intermediate nuclear missiles was signed. With policies like Glasnost and Perestroika, Soviet Union started opening up. With Cold War rapidly coming to a close, License to Kill based its plot around the very tense drug wars of Mid and South America. The villain, Franz Sanchez, is of course based on Pablo Escobar, with his massive drug empire, his own city, his brutality, and his pet iguana. The film sees Bond and his bro, Felix Leiter, capturing Sanchez. Unfortunately, Sanchez's deep pockets ensure his escape, which leads to mangling of Felix and the death of Felix's wife. Sanchez retreats back to the fictional state of Isthmus, where he's practically untouchable because of the so-called Sanchez Law.
Plomo or plata?
Leto silver.
Switch the words around and you also have Escobar's famous policy. Bond therefore must go on a personal revenge mission to get him. The film heavily takes inspiration from the late 80s, early 90s battles inside and against drug trade, which centered around Escobar and his Medellin cartel that at one point distributed 80% of the world's cocaine. The film touches on the notion of how the drug trade is an international massive business and how certain individuals can reach a sense of immunity where no institutions can touch them. Nothing of course lasts forever. Both Sanchez and Escobar eventually met violent deaths. This brings us back to the downfall of another type of giants. With stagnating economy and increasing calls for independence, USSR started to come undone. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev announced the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, which led to the formation of the Russian Federation. During these seismic events, Bond disappeared.
While you were away, the world changed.
Not for me.
With the dissolution of Soviet Union and signing of the START Treaty, which heavily limited the amount of nukes a nation can have, the world stage had been heavily rearranged. USA tested its new status in a Gulf War against Iraqi forces in Kuwait, which was a massive success. On the other hand, Europe was changing rapidly with the reunification of Germany and new nations popping out of Eastern and Central Europe. Yugoslavia became especially heated, with several republics seeking independence. This led to a series of bloody wars and ethnic cleansings, with Serbia and its leader, Slobodan Milosevic, being especially brutal in their actions. The scale and length of these conflicts were fueled by the lackluster reactions of the USA and the European community. Influence in general was shifting to the West, but the principles of foreign policy had become harder to define. Also, in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty was signed and European Union was formed, with UK as one of its founding members. This was not the world that Bond left, and there were some who doubted if Bond was relevant in the new world. In 1995, after 6 years, the film GoldenEye would reflect the changed world and reevaluate elements of the series' past. In the film, a Russian General Oromov steals a Soviet-made device that can transmit a destructive EMP pulse from orbit which destroys the electronics of the targeted area.
What the bloody hell was that?
This mirrors the concerns around the misplacement and selling of Soviet weapons after the Cold War. Due to corrupt officials amongst other things, Russia's former satellite states, especially Ukraine, became a black market for several smaller nations and private individuals seeking to wage their own wars. There were also fears that the massive stockpiles of Soviet nukes were in danger of falling into the wrong hands. With international cooperation, the stockpiles fortunately were secured. However, an unknown amount of Soviet nukes were lost during the Cold War. The film starts with conventional Cold War crutches, but through a revelation that the main villain is another 00 agent, the lines start to blur. 006, or Alec Trevelyan, is revealed to be a descendant of the Lians Cossacks. In this context, Cossacks were East Slavic Orthodox people whom during the Second World War allied with Germany to fight against Soviet Union. At the end of the war, the British caught up with the Cossacks in Austria, whom hoped that they could join the British in their future fight against Soviet communism. The British were seemingly sympathetic, but it was already decided in the Yalta Conference that any POW Stalin deemed to be a Soviet citizen, including Cossacks, should be repatriated. This was problematic since many of them had left before the Soviet Union was formed, and as enemy collaborators, Stalin's retribution on them could be extremely brutal. Nevertheless, to ensure repatriation of their own citizens, the British started giving up the Cossacks through deception and even physical force. The process got especially violent around Lienz, with Cossacks aggressively resisting and some even committing suicides. Tens of thousands were repatriated, including women and children. They ended up in the hands of NKVD and Smersh. The high-ranking members were executed, and most ended up in the gulags, until 1955 and Khrushchev's de-Stalinization process. By bringing up this event from Britain's past, the film slightly reconsiders the moral authority Britain and West have levied against the Soviet Union. Trevelyan's plan is to use the GoldenEye to destroy London just after virtually robbing the Bank of England, combining his need for revenge with financial gain. The Russian villains are also financially motivated, forfeiting any possible nostalgia towards Soviet Union, thus evoking the shady stories of people in legal and criminal sectors exploiting the turmoil of the early 90s Russia. With Tomorrow Never Dies, Bond continues tackling the themes of the dramatically changing world. With capitalism essentially winning the Cold War, multinational corporations came into the forefront as superpowers. The first embodiment of this is Elliot Carver, a British media mogul with the power to topple governments with a single news story. A key inspiration for Elliot Carver is Rupert Murdoch, founder of the News Corporation, which prior to its 2013 split was the largest media company in the world based on its total assets. One of Murdoch's most famous creations is Fox News, which he started in 1996. Murdoch's businesses have been accused with illegal information gathering and misleading news coverage, which has skewed the political development of USA, UK, and Australia. Carver, with the help of Chinese General Chiang, is provoking a World War-level conflict between Britain and China. As a result, Chiang would get the leadership of China, and Carver would get the exclusive news broadcasting rights to the region. This unholy coalition of communism and capitalism evokes Goldfinger and You Only Live Twice, with a bit more grounded and modern flair. The threat brings Bond into collaboration with Chinese agent Wei Lin. The pairing is very timely, because in 1997, the British Empire had a formal ending with handover of Hong Kong to China. With China rapidly becoming a major world player, and UK arguably being finished as such, the mutual collaboration gives the series a familiar sense of assurance that Britain can still be relevant and cooperation between disparate nations can be possible. This sentiment is also underlined in the opening action scene with the joint mission between British and Russian military officials. The malicious corporate interests are further explored in The World Is Not Enough. The film sees Bond being tangled in the East European oil business. The film's villain, Electra King, seeks to secure her oil pipeline routes in the Caspian Sea by causing a nuclear disaster in Istanbul, forcing the competing Russian pipelines to distance themselves from the region. The film gazes a bit prophetically to the future by aligning the corporate villain Electra with the modern terrorist threat of the anarchist Renard. Renard, unlike other fanatical villains of the past, is not allegiant to the state or absurd superiority, rather a radicalized philosophy.
Revenge is not hard to fathom for a man who believes in nothing. And what do you believe in? Preservation of capital?
Which is then exploited by a charming capitalist. The mixture of political fanaticism and free market capitalism is brought to a cartoony climax with Die Another Day. The film's villain, and stay with me now, is a fanatical North Korean named Colonel Moon, who fakes his death, changes his DNA to form an identity as a diamond billionaire Gustav Graves, and with his new resources, creates a sun-harnessing satellite weapon which he uses to invade South Korea. Okay. Well, echoing the novel Moonraker and its villain Hugo Drax, the film explores the idea of a capitalist cult of personality, which were becoming increasingly prevalent in the world stage with Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Richard Branson. Characters who head massive companies while building their public image around daring innovations that seek to benefit and evolve human civilization. With Graves, the film explores the dark side of the visionary. What could happen if someone like that would use his powers for evil, and we couldn't recognize it because we were blinded by the shining image? The film explores the remnants of the Cold War by setting it to the few small vestiges of Cold War and communism that still exist, with North Korea, Chinese-held Hong Kong, and Cuba.
Unless you want to be known as Fidel Castrata. Rapido, vámonos!
Unlike Fleming's novels, which were more openly hostile towards Soviet communism, the film is temperate, if a bit self-righteous, when regarding these regimes. While the villains are North Korean, the film does shed some responsibility of the country's current state to the meddling of the superpowers. Though it is a bit off-putting that this softer touch ends up disregarding the pervasive terror and oppression North Korean people face. The 90s and the turn of the millennia was an odd period for the Western world and entertainment in general. After the Cold War and the apparent victory of Western capitalism, the US and its allies were a bit at loss, as the lack of something to oppose made creating international consensus trickier. All in all, for the majority of the West, 90s was marked as a period of security that didn't have any overlaying threats that motivated collective purpose. Rather than changing, the Bond films more accurately just updated the thematic principles of the novels. Fleming conceived Bond based on his experiences in World War II and placed him in the Cold War while the British Empire was in decline. With the end of the Cold War and Britain's power shifting again with Hong Kong handover and EU membership, Bond series re-established itself by taking on the destabilizing aftershocks of the post-Soviet world and the dark side of rampant capitalism, while reassuring itself that UK still has relevance. This was expressed with ever more silly action spectacles that the audiences of the 90s wanted. However, by the time Die Another Day came out, the world had faced its most dramatic event of the recent past, and there was no room for inane flippancy anymore. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, attacked the World Trade Center in New York. Death toll was almost 3,000, the single highest deliberate loss of life on American soil in history. With international support, USA declared the war on terror, and soon after, the invasion of Afghanistan. In 2003, USA invaded Iraq in order to oust the dictator Saddam Hussein. The first years were successful, but then the international opinion on the war started souring, with growing suspicion that the real endgame was the control of the region's oil resources. On domestic field, the Patriot Act and increased international surveillance raised concerns regarding violations on individuals' freedoms. When Bond series came back, it ironically went back to its very roots. There is a good book about goodness and how to be good and so forth, but there's no evil book about how to be evil and how to be bad. The devil had no prophets to write his 10 Commandments, and no team of authors to write his biography. His case has gone completely by default. We know nothing about him, but a lot of fairy stories from our parents and schoolmasters. He has no book from which we can learn the nature of evil in all its forms, with parables about evil people, proverbs about evil people, folklore about evil people. All we have is the living example of people who are least good, or our own intuition. Ian Fleming, Casino Royale. Casino Royale forms a curious circle in the series, being the first story Fleming ever wrote that is now adapted for the 21st century as a reboot for the Bond film series. Bond's mission is to take part in a high-stakes poker game against Le Chiffre, a banker for the world's terrorists, who has just lost over 100 million of his clients' money, because the terror attack he set up to make money failed. Like many times before, the film sidesteps away from political or ideological villainy by making Le Chiffre a financially motivated terrorist.
Do you believe in God, Mr. Le Chiffre?
No. I believe in a reasonable rate of return.
The film ends with ambiguity that implies a new structure in modern threats that permeate every facet from an African warlord to Albanian banker up until the upper echelons of governments and business. The business side is exemplified in arguably one of the most reality-conscious films in Quantum of Solace. In the film, environmentalist activist Dominic Green, aided by the mysterious Quantum Organization, is overtaking the limited freshwater supply of Bolivia. This is done by supporting a coup in Bolivia and making the country essentially subservient to the Quantum Organization through this puppet government. The unwitting collaborator in this is the CIA, that turns the blind eye to this and suffering of the locals so they can get the non-existent oil resources from the Bolivian desert. This is directly influenced by the 1999-2000 Cochabamba Water War, a series of violent protests in Bolivia when its fourth largest city, Cochabamba, saw its water supply getting privatized, dramatically raising the cost of the drinking water. This ties heavily to the actual depletion of natural resources and how that affects foreign policy of the consuming countries. When M informs the British officials on the shadiness of the USA's oil deal, the reaction is pragmatic dismissal.
You're right. Say Green is a villain. If we refuse to do business with villains, we'd have almost no one to trade with. The world's running out of oil, Em. The Russians aren't playing ball, the Americans and Chinese are dividing up what's left. Right or wrong doesn't come into it.
In order to maintain the status quo and to gain quality of life, ethical compromises must be made even on the levels of human rights protection. The even more insidious implication of this compromised status is highlighted by the idea that the evil Quantum Organization is directly associated with the British Parliament.
They say you're judged by the strength of your enemies.
By the end of the 2000s, the idea of internet and computer technology as the true power and threat in the modern national security was being laid out. In 2010, two sets of classified documents called the Afghan War Documents and the Iraq War Documents were leaked to the public. These documents illustrated the vast amounts of civilian casualties that the wars had caused, dramatically exceeding the previous estimates. Public consciousness was especially taken with leaks regarding mistaken attacks against journalists from Reuters newspaper. These leaks were made by WikiLeaks, led by Julian Assange. Assange, who was originally a prolific Australian hacker, became a very notorious public figure. He was celebrated by many because the leaks were able to hold such powerful entities accountable. However, because vast amounts of the documents were leaked unredacted, there was heavy criticism that such leaks would risk the safety of American operatives and their allies in these regions. His character also came under scrutiny with increasingly self-grandizing behavior and allegations of sexual assault, which he denies, calling them a smear campaign. Hacker groups like Anonymous also came into public consciousness. The film Skyfall pits Bond against Raul Silva, a former agent whom, after being abandoned by MI6, works as a private hacker selling his services to the highest bidder. The film sees Silva stealing a list that holds the identities of covert MI6 agents around the world. Silva then starts leaking their identities, putting them in lethal danger. This is meant to be a revenge against M, whom is then forced to answer for her conduct. Silva essentially is the distillation of the demonization that Assange and others like him faced. Contrary to the idea of the noble crusader, Silva is an entirely self-serving individual who wields computer technology to cause massive harm based only on his own whims. By framing the disruptive hacker as a malicious threat, the film clings to an idea that opaque military action and secrecy in the hands of these government institutions are ultimately forces for good. However, a major revelation in 2013 broke this idealism in the eyes of the public.
My name's Ed Snowden. I'm 29 years old. I work for Booz Allen Hamilton as an infrastructure analyst for NSA in Hawaii.
In 2013, Edward Snowden's revelations on the mass surveillance that the NSA was implementing internationally shook the world. It was in a sense a culmination of events that really started with 9/11 and the Patriot Act, which then fed into a series of surveillance programs and legislations that violated the privacy of potentially billions of people around the world. Be honest, were you concerned about your webcam spying on you before this? Snowden leaks also implicated several other countries in illicit surveillance, including United Kingdom's GCHQ and their program Tempora. Tempora is a program that allegedly gathers, for example, phone recordings, Facebook entries, and general personal internet history. The accusations were made that the GCHQ actually gathers more data than the NSA, and Snowden himself called them worse than the US. This might have been surprising, but the history of extra-legal information gathering goes back further than you might think. As was stated before, in 1943, with the BR-USA agreement, USA and UK facilitated their intelligence sharing alliance. The Perpetual Alliance was formalized in 1946 with UK-USA agreements. In 1948, the agreement was extended to Canada, and in 1956 to Australia and New Zealand. What started as a more traditional surveillance alliance then expanded to, for example, satellite surveillance with systems like the Echelon. After 9/11 and the Patriot Act, the alliance started increasingly expanding internet surveillance. Snowden described them as follows: a supranational intelligence organization that does not answer to the known laws of its own countries. What is this organization called? The Five Eyes. In Spectre, Max Denby's head of the new MI6, proposes the Nine Eyes program that pulls the information of the leading nations into a single surveillance system. Alarmingly, this surveillance system is made possible by private donations made by our old friend in terror, Spectre.
Don't let me interrupt you.
Spectre plans to use the surveillance platform to stave off any action taken against them. Spectre's motives echo the revelations that the Five Eyes programs are not used just for security, but also economic and industrial espionage done against its allies. Denby is not only a willing collaborator in this, but a believer in a notion that democracy and personal freedom must be sacrificed to ensure security. Because the British government has been compromised so deeply, Bond and his compatriots have to go underground and illegally attack their own structures of power. So, James Bond, a character who was once an unwavering tool of the late British Empire, is now taking direct action against his own country to protect its supposed integrity. A through line of the Greg era has been a growing ambivalence to governments and intelligence services as forces for good. Every story has been inching a bit closer to home with this. In Quantum of Solace, the problem was the CIA and the politicians. In Skyfall, MI6's relevance is questioned left and right, and in Spectre, the threat is the private powers inside the Secret Service. And finally, in No Time to Die, the problem is Bond's boss and the head of 00 Section, M. In the film, M, with the help of maniacal Dr. Obruchev, has created a DNA-targeting nano-weapon called Heracles. The idea is that you can program the nanobots to target a certain DNA profile and then release it to the public. It would then move through the people harmlessly until it finds the target and kills them. A perfect kill without collateral damage. Heracles essentially attempts to be a solution to the modern problem of assassinations that are generally done with drone strikes. While they have been effective, they also reportedly cause severe amounts of civilian casualties. The weapon is stolen by a maniacal Safin who intends to turn Heracles into a weapon of mass destruction. Bond, who has been retired for 5 years, is pulled back in to set things right. The film inadvertently stumbled to relevancy because of the corona pandemic with its virus-like weapon. The more prescient theme, however, is that the threat of the story was created by M and the structures he represents. His actions weren't based on maliciousness, but sincere need to do good.
I've dedicated my life to defending this country. I believe in defending the principles of this of this.
But by doing so, he has made the world more dangerous. By bringing roots of the threat close to home, the film challenges the inherent value of the militaristic framework that the existence of MI6 and Bond hinges on. Bond is then tasked with saving the world from this self-created threat, laying the groundwork which ends with him sacrificing himself. In the end, a drink is poured, few words are said, and MI6 just goes on existing without its greatest warrior. So, what can we extrapolate from this long-winded and meandering chronicle? As a film series, or even as a fiction series in general, James Bond has a unique perspective, made possible by its longevity. It is arguable that the 20th century was the most important century in history, given the massive revolutions in economical, technological, and political stages. So, James Bond novels and films have in their decades of existence observed the tumultuous and unpredictable world through flashy globe-trotting adventures. But what kind of world does the series then paint in return? The notion of what is evil has been in a state of flux, but the constant theme in the series is the idea of individuals trying to exploit others for their own gain. The villains aren't typically loyal to anything but their own destructive selfishness. What is the logical counterbalance to that? A brave person of service, willing to push against this exploitation and win. This is of course overly simplistic and a rather conservative setup. Geopolitics are always marked by grayness, uncertainty, and unintended consequences. Also, with shouldering the blame to clear-cut malevolent individuals, the films absolve the governments, militaries, and economic institutions from wrongdoing. Every problem is distilled to a single villain that can just be shot or exploded, so the establishment and institutions never have to think too hard about what's their responsibility in the current state of things. This is also why it's useful to create villains that exist outside of ideology and just want money and power. While the film series has played lip service to responsibility with North Korea and Lian's Cossacks, it is notable that this British icon, for example, has never really reckoned with the legacy of British colonialism. While Bond has had moments where he questions the value he brings to the world as an assassin, the stories always get back on track in the end, as there are always bad guys to defeat. But should the Bond series hold these institutions accountable? The fascinating development in the post 9/11 films is that they have turned the malicious villain into a key component of the sacred institutions, eroding them from within. This speaks to a sense of maturity that the series has gained, but this might also be a start of a creative existential crisis for the series. If the movies continue with the sense of socio-political authenticity, are they then stuck with self-critical deconstruction? On the other hand, if the series goes full-on fantasy, does it then have to disregard any sense of reality? The big topics of today are environmental destruction, rise of authoritarianism, and ever-deepening wealth inequality. However, the films might be wary to touch authoritarianism because it might bar the films from the Chinese markets. Discussing wealth inequality just might come across as ironic, as MGM and Eon were recently bought by Amazon, led by a Bond villain hopeful Jeff Bezos, and there aren't that many ploys regarding climate change that can use this kind of blunt instrument. In 2012, James Bond film series celebrated its 50th year with Skyfall. The film's core theme is the question if James Bond has any place in the modern world. The idea that Bond is an old-fashioned relic isn't new. Arguably, that has been the case since the very beginning. Fleming was inspired by the adventure heroes of his youth, who were brooding, insular men of action. He then took this archetype and brought it to the post-war Europe, which was much harder and scarier place. The fact that Bond was created partially as a reaction to the decline of the British Empire can be disregarded, and this in a sense makes him a relic. This idea has become more and more pointed as the public discourse has become increasingly negative towards the history of colonialism. Fleming's novels discuss the frustrations of the empire's decline, but never learned to embrace the new status quo, so the films had to find a way forward on their own. As the real-world inspirations have illustrated, Bond series shifted its standing from a representation of a formerly Great Britain into a collaborator with America and its policies. However, as Bond is not really an American character, the series has had the luxury of stepping back from the us versus them mentality and champion more apolitical peace and stability. Because political realities fluctuate so rapidly, Bond isn't as much a Western patriot fighting against its enemies than a paragon of order fighting against chaos. In this sense, Bond's development is similar to Captain America's, someone who started as a clear patriotic representation of his country and then developed into a more adaptive defender of freedom and security. But will the Bond series ever truly reckon with its imperial roots? That remains to be seen, but let's not get too serious. These are in the end escapist action-adventure films and not attempts in geopolitical analysis. The key contribution of the film series is Assurance, which has now lasted for decades. Whether he is fighting the remnants of the Stalinist forces or chaotic techno-terrorism, we know that in the end, he always wins. With the tensions rising again between superpowers and individuals amassing even more wealth and power, the classic Bond stories might become more relevant than ever before. Bond films are many things to many people. They are filled with exotic locations, style, kinetic action scenes, clever gadgets, enchanting women, and in the middle of it all, the quintessential masculine hero. It is no coincidence that 3 different US presidents have professed being fans. Very much like superheroes, Bond is a power fantasy. A nice assuring thought that you, me, or anyone else, through sheer will and competence, can make the world more safe and fair. Spruce that ideal with a good drink and a suit, what else do you need? This fantasy is amplified by rooting the series on contemporary realities involving the audience in its conflicts, its trials, and its victories. The world is unpredictable, and sometimes even scary. So there's nothing wrong with the good old assurance that James Bond will return.
Bond? Come back alive.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. Just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace.